A review of What Are They Saying About Acts by Mark Allan Powell, presented by David Anthony. Mark Allan Powell, the author of What Are They Saying About Acts, is the Robert and Phyllis Leatherman Professor of New Testament at Trinity Lutheran Seminary. He was the general editor of the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary and has authored over 20 books, including What is Narrative Criticism, Introduction to the New Testament, and What Are They Saying About Luke, which can be seen as the companion volume to What Are They Saying About Acts. Interestingly, he's also a regular contributor to the Lutheran magazine, where he sometimes reviews new Christian music. In his introduction to Acts, Dr. Powell clearly outlines his goals and intentions. This book, he says, provides an overview of current scholarship on Acts. Selected works are surveyed with no pretense at being exhaustive. Rather, the focus is on the identification of trends and delineation of representative positions. He succeeds in presenting in clear prose past and present trends of scholarship, albeit with a glossing of representative views. But as promised, as an introductory work, it gives a valuable overview of trends and opens the doors to deeper exploration. His book is divided into an introduction, 6 chapters, and a conclusion. We have already examined his authorial mission statement found in the introduction. The chapters outline broad approaches to the study of Acts, Luke's second volume, the theology of Acts, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, the Church and Acts, eschatology and ecclesiology, reading Acts as history, and reading Acts as literature. Each chapter offers subtopics with specific areas of research interest, and a conclusion which points to current and possible future trends of scholarship. The pace of writing is fast. Powell examines a number of research areas in each chapter, highlighting recent approaches and giving contrasting opinions among scholars. Its strength as an overview of research trends is also a weakness, as a few sentences are used to express broad and often complex topics. The writing is clear, however, and Powell is able to express the main themes of scholarship, providing a well-structured overview for the casual reader, while also providing new avenues of research for scholars in the field. Chapter 1, Luke's Second Act, builds on the current recognition that Luke and Acts were not just written by the same author, but they should be studied together as related and possibly united works. This idea sprang from a seminal work by Henry Cadbury, The Making of Luke Acts, published in 1927. Powell is careful not to leave the impression that all scholars share this Acts unification theory, but it is the common theory today. Even for scholars who view Luke Acts as a unified work, the level and meaning of this unification varies. Some, like F.F. Bruce, believe Luke and Acts were written as a single book, but were contained on different scrolls. The 2 scrolls were separated in the process of assembling the New Testament, and though they're separated, they should be viewed as the same work. Others, like Stephen Wilson, believe Acts was written many years after Luke was completed, and though sharing some similarities in style and structure, should be considered more of a sequel than a single work. Building on his earlier work, What Are They Saying About Luke?, the author states his intention to avoid repeating, whenever possible, discussions explored in that text, while promising not to bypass any major topic of scholarship. Given the close relationship between Luke and Acts, however, the reader may want to read the previous Lucan overview before jumping into Acts. As Powell does not build on a single thesis in this book, but presents dozens of scholars' views in each chapter, I use my reading as an opportunity to find areas of scholarship close to my own interest and perspectives, as well as for areas of contention with my own views. The For Further Reading section is a clear roadmap for new biblical scholars like myself. In reviewing this book, I think exploring a single chapter in some detail will provide a better understanding of the book than trying to express such a wide view of themes in a short paper. I found Chapter 3, The Theology of Acts, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, of special interest. Powell also states that everything that Luke recounts has theological significance. Accordingly, the bulk of scholarship devoted to his writings has attempted to interpret them in terms of their theology. Examining how Acts identifies God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and the relationship between those divine figures, gives an image of Luke's theology, as well as glimpses into the theology of the early church. Luke does not give explicit descriptions of God, but an image of Luke's God can be brought out of the text. As Powell writes, very little in the book of Acts describes God's attributes outright. What Luke believes about God is largely assumed within the narrative and must be discovered by paying careful attention to its distinctive features. While noting that Acts God bears a strong similarity to the vengeful God of the Old Testament, Powell describes the first clear attribute of Luke's God as the controller of history. As he says, God determines what will happen as well as when, where, and how it will happen. God is in charge. Citing Robert O'Toole's book, The Unity of Luke's Theology, Powell shows how the use of verbs in Acts gives a precise definition of God as one who fulfills, brings to pass, determines, sets, and appoints the actors and their actions. In particular, Luke's use of the verb dei, defined as it is necessary or it must, to accentuate the role of God as the author of destiny, including Jesus' passion and the founding of the early church. As the driving force of history, God is also the author of soteriology, or salvation history. Describing both the Old and New Testament, Luke writes to show how God, who brought salvation to Israel in the past, continues to bring salvation to Christians in the present. This highlights the second major attribute of Luke's God. God makes promises and keeps them. Again, highlighting the work of a Lucan scholar, Powell shows how Robert Karras has expanded on Jesus' ministry and resurrection as fulfillment of God's Old Testament promises. With the absence of the expected parousia, Karras argued that Luke expands the idea of God as a promise keeper, not primarily to prove that Jesus was prophesied by the promises made to the Jewish people. Instead, Luke wanted to stress that God keeps his promises to assure the early church that he would not forget the promises made by Jesus concerning his coming kingdom. Recent scholarship has focused heavily on Luke's Christology. Luke's possible reliance on alternate or extinct Christological traditions have been raised, but have met limited acceptance. Instead, focusing on the work of C.F.D. Moule and Darrell Bock, Powell points to recent scholarship examining differences between Jesus as portrayed in Luke's and Acts. In Moule, Powell finds the Christology of Acts is more exalted than that of the Gospel, a development that is logical in light of the post-resurrection perspective that Acts intends to represent. In the same vein, Bach explains that the Gospel begins with a consistent portrayal of Jesus as the Messiah, but progressively introduces tensions that imply he is more than the Messiah. These tensions are resolved in Acts, where Jesus is declared to be Lord as well as Messiah. Other Christology topics examined by Powell are whether Jesus is already present on earth, or if he has removed to heaven, leaving Christians to await his return at the time of the parousia and the process of salvation. Also, does God offer salvation through Jesus' death and resurrection, or has the arisen Christ taken the act of salvation onto himself? Finally, the Holy Spirit is seen by many as being a main focus of the Acts of the Apostles. As Powell writes, the Holy Spirit, of course, figures greatly in the book of Acts, so much so that Luke's second volume has been referred to as the Gospel of the Holy Spirit. In Acts, the Holy Spirit is seen as an entity found in the Old Testament, though many scholars see the identity and function of the Holy Spirit as in flux. For many, Pentecost marks a change in the character of the Holy Spirit. As seen by various researchers, the Holy Spirit is seen transforming from a national force to a universal force, from an animistic energy which temporarily possessed spiritual leaders in the Old Testament to a divine energy which permanently fills the church, and even begins to be seen as an independent person who operates at God's discretion. Thus, Francis Bovand says that the Holy Spirit gains a personal stature for Luke comparable to that of God or Christ, and John Hull observes, if there is no doctrine of the Trinity as such in Acts, all the materials are certainly there. What Are They Saying About Acts succeeds in providing an overview of historical and recent scholarship regarding the Acts of the Apostles, and is a valuable resource for laity and clergy who seek a fuller understanding of Luke's Gospel, or Luke's second book, and also for scholars who are looking for productive avenues of research. I found it to be helpful and a great guide to scholarship.